Welcome, everybody. We're just going to get started. My name is Kartik. I'm one of the co-founders of ETHGlobal, and I'm super excited to be doing this thing today. We have over 100 people watching on just the Zoom alone, and this is also being live streamed directly on Twitter and YouTube. So for those of you who don't know, this is part of HackFS. HackFS is a month-long event that's being run by ETHGlobal in partnership with Protocol Labs. And the goal for this event is to offer the developers out here building on Web3 the opportunity to play with what's possible in the Filecoin and Ethereum ecosystem. And all these developers are using the amazing set of tools and technologies available from both Filecoin and the Ethereum ecosystem and really experimenting with what's possible by combining storage and the features of smart contracts and programming languages. So for this event in particular, we have over 470 hackers that are working on 230 different projects that leverage Filecoin or Ethereum or both, participating from 50 different countries, spanning 19 different time zones. And it's absolutely incredible that we're halfway through this event and we're finally seeing progress on what everybody's building on, and the amount of creativity, the amount of technical prowess, and just the amount of amazing projects that we never thought would be possible in the traditional sense are being built here. And we're really excited to show and share what they will be soon to everybody. But today, this talk in particular is about a topic that is very relevant to where we are now. So we're at the midpoint for this event, and we want to talk about something that is not only just relevant in mainstream media through to some recent events, but also a pretty big theme for what our participants are working on for this hackathon. So last week, as you may all know, a hacker was able to get in control of many important Twitter accounts and use that opportunity to sort of run a scam. And gaining access to someone else's account has been a very common issue in kind of the modern web and social media platforms in general, along with things like being banned or being deplatformed, combating fake news, influencing other users' behavior, figuring out what a sustainable business model is for social networks, and of course, the ever-growing problem that's our favorite, angry people on the internet. So for this talk in particular, today in particular, I wanted to talk about something that is very relevant to this topic, and that is obviously what a future of a decentralized social media platform looks like. For HackFS, we have over 50 different projects that are building something that tackle a decentralized version of a social media platform. That's an amazing number of projects that are doing anything from alternatives to Medium, Twitter, audio sharing platforms, you name it. We're seeing a lot of them being built right now, and we'll see a lot of them ready to be showcased to everybody else in 2 more weeks. And not only that, I guess actually the Ethereum Foundation is also sponsoring a prize for the best decentralized social network as part of the hackathon submission. So we're really excited to see kind of what everybody builds here. So we wanted to use this opportunity to call upon some of our favorite people in this space who've been thinking about what a future of a social media platform is going to look like for quite some time. And what we'll be doing today is we'll be asking them questions about what they think a good alternative is, and what the current problems are, and how should we think about solving them. And on top of all of that, like, how do we actually think about designing something like this if somebody wants to take on this challenge? So we'll also be doing a Q&A from all of our Zoom and YouTube audiences. So if you have any questions that you want to ask our panelists as part of their talk, feel free to just write them as questions on the chat, and we'll kind of be curating that list and asking them questions at the end. And without further ado, I'd like to call up Vitalik, who's the co-founder of Bitcoin Magazine, Juan, who's the co-founder of Protocol Labs, and Balaji, Srinivasan, who is a ghostwriter. So with that, please welcome all of our panelists on stage. And I really want to thank all of you for being here. So my first question to all three of you is, it's a pretty loaded term when we say we need a decentralized social media platform. So what I really want to do is just kind of have each of you tell us what you actually mean when somebody says social media should be decentralized, and how do you interpret that as a phrase? And we'll kind of kick it off with Balaji. You're admitted.
All right, can you hear me now? Good.
Yes.
So, you know, when I talk about decentralized media, it's not just decentralized social media, but it's also decentralizing legacy media corporations. Those are tightly related, especially these days. And I think that goes hand in hand. You know, for example, when you talk about decentralizing social media, you're talking about you know, 1 million hubs and 1 billion spokes, right? Folks being able to set up, you know, federated networks, and folks being able to log in, people being able to sign their content with private keys, using, you know, technologies like staking to help with decentralized moderation, using end-to-end encryption, of course, to secure things, you know, maybe having the networks be pseudonymous to reduce the impact of, you know, like doxing and offline attacks and swatting of that kind, implementing positive sum behavior, like having economic interaction within those networks, and you know, obviously censorship resistance with technologies like ENS and HNS. These are all things that we think about when we talk about decentralized social media. Decentralized legacy media is stuff like decentralized Hollywood, for example. You know, AI video allows you to go and make Hollywood quality videos on your laptop. Decentralized publication is sort of going back to blogs, but with monetization. So having paid newsletters and then thinking about ways to network them together. For example, there's a, you know, not just Mastodon and things like Secure Scuttlebutt, but also little features like quotebacks.net, which allow you to do Twitter style RTs, except on a blog, which are pretty cool, nice little formatting. And, you know, decentralized media basically also means if you give individuals the ability to monetize on their own, potentially pseudonymously, there is less pressure for them to be part of an intellectual orthodoxy where they have to repeat, you know, certain nostrums to retain their job in an uncertain environment. And you're seeing that on Substack, for example, where folks not only can think independently, but must think independently as they're in a competitive marketplace for subscribers. And so it's a very different incentive structure than the typical sort of, you know, Brooklyn, like East Coast incentive structure. So that's my kind of kickoff, is decentralized social media and decentralized legacy media are very much hand in hand. And in fact, I expect that the successful platforms will actually break down, you know, that barrier, that content and code will be kind of thought of as similar, and you're going to combine kind of the evangelism, the values of the community with the technology of the community, and that's going to be influential. We already see that in crypto, but I think we're going to see much more of that.
That's a lot of content to dig in, and I'm glad that you already prefaced that, so we'll go into a lot more, but we'll kind of maybe let Juan share his perspective here.
Thank you. So I think I agree with a ton of what Balaji has been saying. What I would add is I tend to think about media as think of the memetics of our system, right? So we have a whole bunch of humans spread out across a globe, billions of different processes, processing information. You can think of the brain itself as a different distributed system as well, processing information in different ways. We're talking about the main mechanism by which we broadcast information across billions of people, which, as the internet wired us all up in the last few decades, we've managed to get really, really nice, fast properties around. Our expectations today are very different than they were 30 years ago alone, right? 30 years ago, 50 years ago, we had a completely different landscape around information flow in the world. There are certain things that are possible now that weren't possible then. But part of what's happening now is that we didn't bother to put in any way of controlling for manipulation vectors and attack vectors in the entire stack. So we've created a set of systems that can balkanize not around access or thought, but rather balkanize on manipulation targets. So it's very easy for attackers to divide the network, so to speak, and start playing a subsets of the network against each other and causing all kinds of disinformation campaigns and explicit targeted efforts to cause problems. So I think that is a very serious problem where a number of the kind of first order suggestions for most decentralized media or decentralized social media systems will make that problem orders of magnitude worse, not better. And so I think in order to succeed here, we have to look ahead of those problems and start tackling those larger issues of how do you get to systems that are attack resistant and that enable some distributed notion of getting to truth and getting to detangle what's intersubjective and what's objective. And this is likely going to get worse as the ML systems perfect in terms of fabrication of information. So there's a lot of conversations around what's going to happen when things like deepfakes and so on get much orders of magnitude better and so on. And so we have to think ahead of all those ranges of problems and start building the systems now so that they're ready for when this becomes a much bigger issue. We might transition from a period of massive convergence in the world of basically having very few versions of the stories to a world where there's so many different possible different stories that the majority of humans don't even know what to believe anymore. And they don't have a good mechanism for achieving truth. And that is a much worse state than where we are now. And that could be precipitated by centralized or decentralized media not taking these problems seriously. So I think verifiability of information, getting to intersubjective and objective perspectives, and having a way of preventing authoritarian control and attackers pitting groups against each other. I think those would be the main things that I would focus on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the grand narratives kind of in this whole discussion is this idea that the internet started as this much more decentralized thing, something where you had a lot of different forums, you had a lot of different blogs, and there were lots of different things happening in different corners. And that was how things were maybe 10 to 15 years ago. And now, like, we've moved toward, and first of all, just technological centralization and political centralization that results from that, with a very small number of entities and a very small number of countries, governments being able to have outsized control over just the ability to influence what people see and talk about. And then at the same time, there's also this kind of other effect where we've moved from that kind of clustered blog-like structure to the thing that I call Twitter, which is the world water cooler, right? So, a lot of people, remember, had the mindset that, the old kind of way of doing things led to kind of fragmentation and tribalism and kind of polarization, all these bad things. And the thing we need more of is just for different sides of people to talk to each other. And well, guess what? That's Twitter, right? And Twitter is this wonderful battlefield where, you've got tech people, social justice people, right-wing people, US people, Russia, China, India people, and all of these different tribes that often really disagree with each other and just yelling at each other. And it's not at all clear that the result is better, right? So I guess the way I see this movement, so one of the kind of words that I like, this is James Pitts, an Ethereum Foundation person, I came up with this, is like, instead of thinking about cypherpunk, we think about system punk. So kind of system punk ideology would basically say that, like, the goal isn't just to kind of create spaces where people can do things and assume that that's enough. The goal is to kind of think about things like, what you're incentivizing, what you're showing, what you're creating selective pressure for, and kind of understanding that different kinds of rules can have different consequences. And what we need is, first of all, just more experimentation. And experimentation can't happen if there's only like 2 or 3 places where anything is happening. And we also just need people building these platforms to kind of have this more explicit understanding that that is what they're doing, right? And that it is like sometimes actually kind of hard to figure out exactly what it is that we're trying to target. And a more decentralized approach, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. Like, we can think about taking existing social media approaches and then kind of pushing them in a more decentralized direction. You can think about starting with kind of the starting point of everyone having their own blog, and then adding kind of different decentralized blockchain-based or other whatever components, and just creating this playing field where, if you want to kind of basically kind of unbundle it and kind of think about storage of the content, user interfaces, incentives, kind of choosing what users see kind of as separate problems, and trying to just make it easy to tackle all of those issues individually.
No, that's great. I mean, I think all 3 of you touch on some sort of similar themes here, but maybe just to kind of ask it more directly, is there in particular, like a thing you disagree with on how existing social media platforms currently run, and like the problem that all of them face. So I know, Balaji, you've spoken a lot about Twitter in the past, and what does it mean to exit it? But what exactly are some of these problems? And kind of moreover, just do you think the problems that we have right now with these social media platforms only kind of happen at a scale when they cross a threshold of number of users, or are they going to persist just because of how things are done when a single company is responsible for managing a network that huge?
Well, so one thing I want to say, by the way, is that, you know, building something like Twitter or Facebook was extremely difficult, right? So I respect the folks involved as entrepreneurs because I know how hard that was. And, you know, it's easy for us to sort of sit back and poke holes in it and whatnot. But, you know, if you just think about the customer acquisition, you know, alone, just if you're on a website and you're signing up 1,000 people a day, that's only 365,000 a year, right? If you're talking about the scale that they're at, you know, even signing up 1 million a day is 365 million a year, and it'd still take you 10 years at 1 million a day to get to where Facebook is, right, at 3 billion people roughly, which is insane to think about that, right? Like how the scale of these operations, right? So it was very technically non-trivial. There's no way they could have done it decentralized. They were the winners of a very challenging winner-take-all kind of thing. And, you know, initially the value proposition that they gave of, you know, basically free global calendaring and messaging and publication and groups and, you know, like 50 other functions, right? Photo albums, all of this type of stuff. That was an amazing price relative to the status quo of the 90s, you know, when photo albums, you know, printing them and sharing them and sending them to 1,000 friends was certainly not free, let alone long distance calls and calendars and party organization, all this stuff. But now we've moved into a realm where people have kind of gotten over that initial huge consumer surplus of making all these expensive things free. And they're focused now on, you know, many of the downsides, right? Which include, you know, okay, we put all these people online and they're all attacking each other. You know, in many ways, the laws of Twitter, the code of Twitter is more like the laws of physics. It just kind of governs how particles colliding to each other at high velocity on Twitter, as opposed to like, you know, the laws of a state where, you know, there's some expectation of positive behavior. I know that Twitter has, you know, some stuff in terms of moderation, but you can't really like hit 911 and call the police in real time. It's like you file a report and, you know, like 2 weeks later, somebody might look at it or what have you. They do not have, you know, great tools for real-time policing beyond, you know, blocking and so on, right? So it's essentially this sort of thing where they've optimized for engagement, as many people have observed, and engagement could be a burning building or somebody getting, you know, beaten on Twitter, right? So I think one major reason this happens is you have, you know, 300 million people on Twitter who are not aligned with each other, right? You know, I mentioned this before, sort of sarcastically, which is that, you know, Twitter is actually now the government of the United States, right? And of Western civilization. No matter, you know, every blue check, every elite in the US and the world may not have much in common, but they get on Twitter for likes and faves and followers. And if their ethics are, you know, poor, or if they're, you know, they're incentivized just the right way, which many of them are, they'll just attack somebody on Twitter for the likes. And they will use it as kind of a real-time poll. You know, people talked about, you know, online voting and the problems with online voting. Well, there's an election happening every day, every hour, every minute on Twitter, right? And, you know, it's like Gladiator, you know, like thumbs up, like, or down, right? And this is literally how policy is happening, right? It's actually kind of crazy, right? You know, there's many good things about Twitter, but it wasn't built to be a government. However, politicians absolutely do use it as a focus group. They absolutely do use it to determine what is popular and unpopular. They will shy away from positions where they're attacked on it and so on. So, you know, Twitter is not always real life, but it will be, and it becomes real life, right? So, you know, when we start thinking about this stuff, we're like, okay, we now have kind of passed the age where we've got large assemblages of people online. We need to start introducing things for like explicit governance, opt-in governance, where when you come into a social network, you're not just clicking through some terms of service. You might actually want to sign like a DocuSign or something like that, or truly go through, you know, a slower growth process where you're kind of shown the rules of this community. And then B, have that stuff enforced by, not just digital kinds of things and moderators, but also decentralized enforcement mechanisms like smart contracts. On a somewhat related note, I want to talk about Juan's point for a second, and then give the mic back to Juan, which was about lots and lots of different stories and narratives. So I do think that, and this, other folks have said this, certainly not a novel observation to me, but, we're going through multiple simultaneous revolutions, right? Where we've got the printing press, like thing. We're also going through an industrial revolution because of, robotics. We're going through like, like a dating revolution because of Tinder and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of these things happening at the same time. And, so I think it is going to be a fracturing of the world. You are going to have something where the internet is splintering, nations, it's unbundling nations, and then it will eventually rebundle them with a bunch of migrations, I think, towards city-states. And I think we're just at the beginning of a period of significant internet-mediated chaos. And, like Foundation, I'm not sure if it's going to be 10 years of this or 100 years of this. We might just be at the very beginning of this stuff. So one of the things that means is, global truth. Where I think we end up with this is we factor things into oracles and advocates. So that's a kind of a meme. Let me talk about that for a second, then hand it over. Oracles are cryptographically signed feeds, that are incentivized for the adjudication of prediction markets, right? So everybody on this call knows what they are. But the thing about them is they're a generalization of what's already happening. Many sports articles are wrappers around box scores. Financial articles are wrappers around ticker symbols. Many political articles or other articles are wrappers around tweets. So in each of these cases, you have verbal content that is generated from the prompt of, machine readable data, right? Like a feed of data, okay? And so you could generalize that and talk about arbitrary feeds of data, these, cryptographically signed feeds. And, Claros is actually having a court case on one of them now, which is a feed of coronavirus, deaths, right? So that's oracles. And then you also have advocates, and advocates are just explicit advocates for a cause. I've got an article coming out where I talk about values.txt, like a robots.txt, a values.txt file that declares the exact causes in the sense of keywords that you are advocating for. And that's now machine readable. That's what you're trying to boost the sentiment of over the long run, over 5 years. And then you may cite the facts that are available in various feeds, but you're an unapologetic advocate. For example, you're just a technologically progressive activist, and you want to use fusion energy to stop climate change or something like that. And now you just factor it cleanly, right? There's machine readable oracles with the facts, and then everything else is narrative. And you don't like try to say that, oh, it's a fact if it's not cryptographically stamped, signed, and hashed and stamped on chain. All right, so let me hand over the mic.
Yeah, I like where a lot of that is headed. I think that there is a massive problem in just establishing truth. So the entire scientific process, for example, takes quite a long time to even validate certain very precise and specific claims about certain kinds of things, right? And even the rigor level of the scientific process sometimes even lets certain fake things through. And like the reproducibility crisis in bio is like a huge thing, and you're super familiar with that. And I think what we're entering is a period where the importance of truth is getting massively magnified because of how decentralized things are. Things are way more decentralized today than they were 30 years ago or 50 years ago, and they're going to get much more decentralized. And so that puts a massive premium on truth. And what backs those oracles is a really hard question. In that, yeah, I think there can be incentive structure schemes to get there, but even beyond that just produces an intersubjective truth. I think we need to get into a much deeper, like hooking into all kinds of verifiable facts about reality, right? So people make claims all the time that are factually verifiable, and yet we don't have a very natural, good process about establishing the validity of that stuff. And yet we walk around with supercomputers in our pockets, and we could be having that, right? So there are projects working on this kind of stuff of putting certain kinds of hardware modules, so you can stamp pictures and video as not being tampered with and actually being taken at a specific point. Like things of that nature will help. But I think we need to get to we need to kind of vault ahead and like leap ahead using tech like GPT-3 is a great concrete example of something that we could be using to start understanding the web of claims and then trying to assess whether or not those claims are actually true or not. So all kinds of NLP tag could be used to detangle the kind of natural language web that we're forming and establish what are we actually talking about, what are the claims being made, and how close are those to truth, and how much evidence there is for these things. And I think moving media away from I often think that we program things with ASCII or UTF-8, but it's kind of like this crazy world where you're manipulating characters, and that's code. And ideally, you would want to be in a much more structured environment. And yet, when we pull back and we think about how we do everything else in humanity, we're still kind of talking about human language moving through all of this computing medium, and with no structured representation yet, right? And I think we're vastly outpacing our building of tools for just the spread of human word is maybe misplaced. Maybe what we should be doing is structuring conversation massively and building systems that allow kind of the incremental effort and work that people are putting in to build to a really good scaffolds of claims and really good scaffolds of narratives, as you're describing, of what might actually have happened or might happen in the future, or predictions and so on, and turn those into testable and falsifiable claims. And then stories, right? Stories are really useful and really valuable in terms of motivating individuals and groups and so on. But being able to distinguish a story from an actual factual claim is extremely important, and we're losing that ability at the moment. And I think it's just going to get worse over the next few years.
Vitalik, do you have anything to add on from what Balaji and Juan have said? If not, we can.
I feel like on that question, they've covered it pretty well.
No, great. So kind of just from synthesizing what all three of you have said, I think there's kind of clearly two categories that sort of stand out. The first one is like, we'll have a decentralized alternative that sort of tackles some of these problems, whether that's fact checking or just prevents people from being banned, so to speak. And you kind of have these two camps where, like, you have on one side a decentralized alternative that succeeds at sort of being feature parity with Twitter or Facebook, and can attract mass audiences, and you just kind of have a massive network that has the scale and the audience to really compete against the incumbents here. Or you have a version of a social network that's alternative to this, where the audience is actually a minority audience that kind of wants to remain there, and they want to have sort of a monopoly on their own niche, but just kind of have the ability to sort of say whatever they like without actually facing any problems that they may get from however moderation is done on the other platforms. Kind of with these kind of two camps out there, which one do you think is more likely? Do you think we'll have a world where we actually get a massive enough social network like Twitter in terms of size that is actually decentralized and solves a bunch of problems that we have with these platforms, or only a certain amount of people will move there and they'll attract only their followers, and they just kind of remain in their small communities, but we'll have many of these communities?
I'd say we're probably going to see a couple of different things at the same time. Like, I think social networks that are like highly decentralized are going to be a kind of minority niche interest, at least for some time. But you could easily see paradigms that at least kind of push things significantly in the direction of being more decentralized, but make some compromises for practicality, like even just moving from Twitter to even things like Substack, or like some people moving to personal blogs, or kind of anything in between. Like, that's a trend that I could definitely see kind of happening in the short term, but at the same time, it's definitely not a push all the way to anything what you could realistically call a kind of fully decentralized social network. So we'll see a lot of those things kind of happening at the same time. I definitely also think that in general, we are going to see the pendulum kind of swing back a bit from the world water cooler to something that's kind of a bit more fragmented, with a bit more kind of room for kind of sub-communities to be more closely connected to each other, and not be kind of put into collisions with the outside world every day, the way that Twitter does. But that could happen in a lot of ways.
It's funny that you call it the world water cooler, because I think of Twitter in a somewhat different way as kind of like the world war zone. But you're right. It's a mixture of both, a library and a civil war, you know. So like just it's actually kind of amazing how both those are tightly related.
Yeah, we had a few of those scares this year alone, right? A number of world war scenario type scares directly on Twitter, while we also expect the kind of water cooler style conversation to happen in the exact same medium with the exact same people and so on. I
was just so surprised that the Twitter hacker didn't do anything more interesting. Like, you could do so many fun things to the Tesla stock price, to like getting countries to.
I mean,
that got some Bitcoin.
It could just have been misdirection. We don't know actually what happened. Actually, there were evidently 8 accounts. This is I'm not sure if you saw this, but there were a bunch of accounts whose at least 8 non-verified users whose DMs were downloaded.
Interesting.
Yeah, Twitter itself reported.
Right.
Did you see that?
I did not. That's interesting. I mean, I guess like what can the hacker do? Like the hacker can scam people for some Bitcoin, make some immediate tweets, quietly introduce some racist tweet into a politician's history that pretends to be from 2014. Download DMs. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of things that are clandestine.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, actually, that part is something that's pretty interesting, which is, something that we take for granted. The reason that tweets are cited in many news articles is people take for granted the fact that Twitter.com did not edit them, right? And so, you basically are like, okay, who said what, when, and often where you get from Twitter, so long as you trust Twitter.com as effectively digitally signing that content. Now that we have, GPT-3, now that we have, some serious possible hacking of Twitter, like serious, like, on a level that's actually kind of embarrassing for them as a service. Even again, I'm friends with some of the folks there, but it kind of sucks for them. It becomes something where you start to go to a higher level of security, especially for politicians and folks who have, fingers on a nuclear trigger or a missile of some kind. One mechanism, and again, this is sort of Monday morning quarterbacking, but, if you had private keys, like a key-based style thing on every phone, and you had to have a digital signature with every post, that would be something where you couldn't just hack it centrally like what happened, because you would need files that were locally on every device, right? So I think that we definitely do need to implement stuff like this.
You know what? I'm still sad we don't have authenticated screenshots. Like it would be like the technology is totally there, right? Like if you want to screenshot parts of a web page, why not just have the server figure out exactly what it would look like and just digitally sign it? But instead, you can do things like if you just screenshot someone's tweets. Like I did this as a joke about a year ago. Someone made a tweet quoting me and saying something that I didn't actually say, and I replied back with, "Don't trust any screenshots that you see on the internet," tweeted by Abraham Lincoln in September 1861.
I think you need a verifiability chain there. Like you need to treat it like the entire provenance of the thing. Like just if it's a screenshot and you're just looking at pixels, like there's an impossibility result there. But if you start thinking about grabbing DOM elements and looking at the entire trace of all of the interactions, then I think that'd be a great hack, by the way. And somebody in the hackathon could actually like build that in a week or two. One thing that I think is pretty critical to returning to your question, Kartik. This question around will there be one or many systems? I think we all agree with Vitalik that there will be many different experiments, and we'll have some big ones and some small ones and so on. My impression is that we're headed towards a much better future where the data structures are going to be decoupled from the UIs. So today, when you think of Twitter and you think of Facebook, you think of completely vertically integrated things where the data, the mechanisms, the identity, all of that is bundled into one simple system. And that's a result of the race that Balaji was describing. They had to move so fast to get there that they had to just beat each other to the market and had to build everything themselves. We're now starting to have the data, the mechanisms and the protocols for moving around all this data in a distributed way. And so you can have things like all the data of something like Twitter be presented with many different clients and many different UIs that tune for different sorts of things, and then move information in a different way. And I think that that's what's gonna, I see this kind of in middle of the road kind of thing where there will be many different systems built on top of the same information graph. And so there'll be just one information graph that's massive that different applications are going to pull different bits about and different kinds of assertions, right? So you could think of interweaving all of these important verifiable claims alongside the media that you attach on posts and all of that kind of stuff. But I think there's a bunch of tooling that needs to be built for the next year or so before those can get good. I think a concrete challenge for folks in the hackathon and beyond is build a toy social media, decentralized social media thing that has 3 or 4 completely different UIs for it, but uses the exact same data structures and the exact same identity. And so you can now start playing around with what will that look like, and how to start introducing different kinds of verifiability.
By the way, just on that topic, I think something that is massively still underappreciated by folks outside our space is the extent to which something like that already exists, in the sense that, you know, Coinbase and Binance and, you know, blockchain.info and BTC.com and so on are all different layers over, you know, the Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains, right? Like these are data structures that are updated, and then you have different views on them. Some are block explorer views, some are exchange views, some are wallet views, and so on and so forth. And one way of thinking about the innovation of blockchains is, you know, they're not, you know, they're quote a database, yes, but they're a database with an unlimited number of simultaneous clients that have root privileges. You know, they can all write, they can all read the entire thing. And your idea of having 6 different interfaces. There's another great paper, by the way, from 10 years ago that I think is worth sort of dusting off and revisiting. It's out of Stanford. It's called Mr. Privacy. And their proposal was essentially to use email as a transport layer, but to build totally non-email looking interfaces on top of email so that you would use Mbox files locally, and you'd use SMTP or IMAP or whatever as a transport layer between. But you could render it totally differently. Like every click of a mouse on, you know, for a like or something could initiate an email, for example, right? Now, eventually you'd want to optimize that. But as a V0, that's not a completely stupid thing to do, because there's 1,000, you know, tools for working with, you know, email data and whatnot. So that's kind of a way of talking about what you're talking about, Juan.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, kind of we've seen flat files as data structures emerge as well in a lot of other cases too. But not to kind of spend too much time on this thing, but actually Twitter had an API that was open for everybody to use. And we actually had multiple Twitter clients that had their own different features and view layers. But kind of just the nature of the business prevents from that sort of defragmentation. So I know we already kind of talked about, or we've actually, I was going to ask, is user fragmentation or content fragmentation a bad thing? And I think we kind of already have sort of answered that it's not really a bad thing, because the sum is net positive here. But maybe just to touch on the fact that, assuming that those two camps existed, like really a lot of fragmented communities, and then, or the other sort of side, which is a massive alternative that is in a way feature complete to existing things that you already know. What exactly do you think is kind of the reason or the incentive for somebody to switch over to the alternative here? Like kind of the common sort of phrase I'm coming from is, and I'm going to take the other side of this argument, is why do I care about being banned or being deplatformed if chances are like I'm 1 out of 10,000 people who actually suffer from these things, and I should not have any problems? What's my incentive to actually look at these communities or alternatives? And what do you think actually gets people over the hump of trying something out that's not the common platform?
Yeah, I would say one simple dumb answer is just like, there's a lot of things that you might want to say that kind of Twitter, the format, doesn't let you say, right? Like tweet storms are much more limiting than you know, writing a blog post. Potentially also, you might not want your whatever you write to be kind of very easily kind of quoted and kind of spread around the echo chamber. Like obviously anyone can go and screenshot it, but even like just the fact that it takes like an active screenshot and cut and paste effort instead of just clicking a retweet button might be kind of an improvement enough. And also just the fact that if you control your own platform, then like you have a lot more ability to customize, and you even have a lot more ability to customize like what kind of discussion happens around your content. So like there's definitely a lot of people for whom like none of those things kind of really matter too much, but like a new paradigm doesn't have to appeal to everyone immediately, right? So I think as long as it offers concrete benefits to some people at the start, that'll be enough to get it started.
I think we're also in a period where building the right thing is more important than getting a bunch of users. Meaning, it's not that hard to get a lot of people to try things out. The internet is so big now that you can find 1,000 to 10,000 users to try something. Just you have to put in effort and so on, and the pathways are there. And if you have the time, you can make that happen. The bigger question from my perspective is, what is the right thing to build? And do you have like all the layers? We're talking about so many different things here, and pretty significant tech team will have to work quite a while to build out a lot of the things that we're talking about, at least to work in the same really nice, seamless way that we're used to from the current interfaces. And so I think a very high leverage position here might be think of how to decouple these systems and make the work of one group interact with the work of another group, right? So the unbundling that we've been talking about, and in terms of separating the layers, think about the data structure separate from the UI, separate from the mechanisms, separate from the incentive structures, like all of that kind of stuff. If we can build good systems that decouple these so that one group might come along, bundle some set of pieces together, turn that into a good product, and then get a lot of adoption around that one product, that will enable us to reuse a bunch of the work that's happening. The fact that if you want to go and build a social network right now, you have to go and replicate everything, all of the work that Twitter has done, is kind of crazy, right? Like and you can't even really compete with the level of product quality that a team like that has, simply because there's large groups of people working on optimizing every single aspect of that interface in mobile across a bunch of different platforms and on the web and so on. And so it's a huge gargantuan task. If we want to actually get something to be broadly used and be really good, I think we have to focus on building the right thing, make sure that it's the right thing, and then put a bunch of effort on that. And so I think it starts with separating the pieces, getting layers right, and then making it very easy for teams to come together, try experiments, make good products. And once we find a really good one, then put a lot of energy behind that. So I think it's a lot of experimentation for now, as opposed to saying, hey, I have my one version, I want to try and get as many people using it.
No, it's great. So I think there's like two other main pieces I want to cover here before we move on to the questions. Kind of a big theme here is that, kind of from what you just said, Juan, this sort of sets us up right for the part where there's clearly two groups here from our audience, from the hackathon, and just in general, like the large participants here. One is somebody who's thinking about solving this problem, and the other party being somebody who wants to use a solution that solves this problem. So I want to actually kind of just take a side here for, like, if I'm like a provider who's making a service that solves a lot of these issues, what exactly should I be thinking about, and kind of what are some of the solutions that I think need to be kind of worked on? So I just have a handful of questions I want to ask, and I want to just see like what you think are the right approaches to something like this thing. The first one is, in the world where I have to make an alternative decentralized version of my platform, are AI and ML algorithms still useful in terms of helping people discover content? Or rather, I actually think Twitter's discoverability is actually a useful feature.
So I think to answer that, AI and algorithms can definitely be valuable, but one kind of nuance that's really important is like who's running the AI and who's choosing the AI for whose benefit. So like the two natural paradigms are, right, like either I'm running an AI client side that can kind of filter content for me, discover content for me, and like to help me write things or whatever, or the other alternative is that there's some AI that's run inside of some centralized platform like Twitter, and that kind of just makes some decisions on whether prioritization, moderation, or whatever else on our behalf, right? And the challenge with centralized AI is basically that, like, if it's not open source, nobody's going to trust it. But if it's open source, then it's exploitable, right? Like the problem is that like what we want out of content on the internet is just so subjective that like you can't easily just create a kind of tight formula, and you definitely can't create, you know, a classifier. Like there's even an entire science of like adversarial AI that basically is dedicated to kind of taking existing classifiers and kind of coming up with ways of basically breaking them and make something that's just a dog with like 45 pixels changed to look convincingly like a cat. So, you know, they're kind of stuck in kind of that trade-off, right? And the interesting thing is that, you know, we have a science that's pretty much exactly about this question of, can we create algorithms that are unexploitable? And that science is called mechanism design, right? And so if we look at mechanism design, where you basically say, you know, we have algorithms, and these algorithms even provide incentives to participants. And a lot of the time, with the way that that approach ends up working is the central kind of logic ends up being relatively simple and ends up being kind of relatively static. But then there's kind of all of these, you know, potentially people, potentially bots, potentially some of both, are kind of swimming around at the edges and kind of contributing all of their information and inputs. And you have like basically this design where all of these kind of intelligent actors around the edges have some kind of incentive where, you know, like if they provide good feedback, or good is ideally, hopefully kind of directly defined by providing value to the users, then they get rewarded. And if they don't, then, you know, they might get penalized. So like that kind of approach is, I mean, even just blockchains themselves are kind of a good example of that paradigm, right? Like you have a very simple mechanism at the core. You know, if you create a block that's part of the chain, you get 2 ETH plus transaction fees. If you create a block that's not part of the chain, you don't get your 2 ETH and you burn a bunch of money building the block. So if we can make things look more like that, then that would be one kind of example of kind of a way out of that kind of out of that conundrum that lets us, you know, have things like AIs without having them be, you know, either a kind of unaccountable secret police, or just get completely exploited to hell as soon as someone runs an adversarial ML thing on it. And this is still one of those areas where we need to think more about.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe I'll just kind of, what I'll do is I'll just round robin these questions, because I have a lot of subparts for this theme as somebody who wants to build a service like this. So maybe for one, what would be an actual good sustainable business model for building something if I'm offering this as a service, whether it's open source or hosted or preferably not hosted? What can people do if they're offering this to somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of very good experimentation with business models. Like I think Substack is a great idea, and we have seen that a number of folks are actually making that a viable business model. So there could be something like that. I think for the platform developers, you know, you can go a bunch of different routes, but I think these days it's not that expensive to develop things at the beginning. So getting some funding to develop this stuff and get a team together to actually try a bunch of experiments and find the right thing. Maybe decouple that from the business model, meaning figure out the structure first and explore a bunch of different business models. But if you kind of raise funding in a kind of a startup style sense of, hey, here's our business model, here's what we're gonna go build, and so on, people will be very locked into that. And so I think right now, I think we need to see a lot more experimentation with different business models to go after options. Some ideas include using tokens to mediate the processing, right? Like use a token native to the platform itself, and the developers can grab some of that token as part of developing the platform. It could also be, you know, in the Substack sense, taking some portion of the revenue that publishers end up making. I think that you know, ads are not going to go away. Ads are such a massively valuable part of the massively valuable business. And ads solve this discovery problem. So ads aren't going to go away. Can we come up with a much better, higher quality, more humane way of doing ads that don't leak all of your information to a ton of parties? That might be like a very interesting, valuable thing to do. If somebody figures that out, then that could be plugged into a bunch of different systems. So I think I think a lot of the business models are going to be similar to the existing ones, just kind of translated into this new world where you get to play with incentive structures.
I think it's going to be, I think something that's very promising is tasks. where, like there's more and more traction for bounty. Certainly, we did this with Earn, and it was actually, I think it's pretty successful with Earn. But also on, with Gitcoin, those are getting traction. On Twitter bounties, those are working. And one way of thinking about it is with an ad, you have to pay the platform for a user's attention. With a task, you pay the user directly for their attention, right? And that's just a better model if you can make it work. The thing that historically has made that difficult is doing small payouts to millions of people with different banking around the world and so on and so forth. And crypto now makes that possible. So I think that's one potential thing that could scale to billions or even trillions in payment volume over time.
No, it's great. I mean, that makes total sense. We're seeing that as a theme in general, and this also scales really well to smaller communities. So maybe a question for you, Balaji, is as somebody who's thinking about making a service that solves this problem, how should they be thinking about sort of moderating and customer support and just in general, like managing a community of users? Like what responsibility should they take, or actually what are the ways to think about handling those issues?
It's a great question. One thing I tweeted a while back is maybe centralization is also underexplored in the design space, right? So, in the sense that, we talk a lot about decentralization, that's very important, but, Elon, for example, has 40 million followers. And what if you could ask them to do something? What if you could tell them to do something, or else they wouldn't be able to follow him anymore, right? And or offer an incentive to do that thing, right? There's different levels of, request to, and so on. And I think you can imagine different communities that have digital communities that have very different subcultures. Like, for example, a productivity cult where to log in each day, you actually have to take a selfie of yourself working out or something like that, right? So I think that you're going to see more kinds of tools like this for kind of not just moderating speech, but behavior, whether it's staking, whether it's, frequency of posting, whether it's quality of posting, whether it is type of content. I think we're really underexplored in terms of mechanisms for both centralized and decentralized moderation. And if we go to this model of 1 million hubs and 1 billion spokes, and give tools for folks, ideally you have kind of some central server that's very easy to deploy and configure, like the Linux of social networks, basically. And Mastodon and others are kind of like this, but they're not yet there. You may need to integrate crypto with it. I think then you start to get a lot of experimentation.
That's great. And kind of just to flip this side on what this may look like for any user who's using a platform like this, does this kind of flip the model of consuming content where I now need to know what I need to follow and who I need to follow? Like kind of going back to the way anyone from like Substacks do like 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, how RSS were dominant. I kind of knew who I wanted to follow. I want to just look out for the new content that they publish. Is this kind of the world we default into, or do you still think, or either of you still think that we'll just still kind of rely on the same distribution discovery mechanisms to find new content that's interesting?
I mean, I think curation is always going to be an important and valuable part of the picture, and I think curation will be both machine-oriented and human-oriented, right? So there will be curation that happens from people curating other groups, and there will be individual curation that you do on top of that, and then there will be all these algorithms that drive content your way. Because it's a market problem at the end of the day, there will be a lot of different options and solutions, and we'll get a good evolution to finding out the right thing. Meaning, a successful platform has to solve this problem. So I'm not too worried about content discovery that much. In that there'll be good mechanisms for it in a successful platform. We'll have to figure it out.
I guess maybe like Balaji, do you think that I guess this type of alternative favors content creators more than consumers?
I think actually, people have asked, how does decentralized media get going? And, Substack and paid newsletters, I think, is how it starts. We attract the power users, the folks who crucially are migrating off of centralized social media for varying reasons. But one that's kind of cross ideological is the lack of control over their brand and monetization. And so they're not making money on social media, or they have to invent Baroque ways of doing it. They don't know if their content is getting promoted and so on. They lack the control. So you get the migration and defection of the elites, the power users, and over time that will pull others because those elites are able to evaluate technologies. They have an incentive to defect and to leave, right? That's I think one aspect of it. There's another thing in terms of curation. Something I've thought about is a feed where you have a few different things. For example, people can only comment or vote up links that are at least a week old, and that actually is a useful thing. There's relatively little news unless it's like a burning building or something like that you absolutely must consume today, now, right? And soon there's a lot of attention around it, but it's often invalidated by reports a day or two later. The truth gets its boots on. So that's kind of one method. Another method would be to require multiple confirmations to upvote it, whether in a decentralized court system or something like that. So I think curation also, there's a lot that we can do in terms of innovation if we just go away from what is just new and popular to maybe what is a little bit older but true.
That's fair. And I guess a question for Vitalik. So, I mean, if people are worried about being sort of banned for what they say, or there are some beliefs, or just not being able to monetize, or being able to say something without anonymously rather, and having a solution that lets you do all these things. What if we actually end up with a world where the winning platform is 4chan? It fits most of these criterias. It's kind of like a network that is somewhat centralized, but also has very curated moderation. Do you think, how do we actually kind of prevent these types of systems from forming and these being the dominant alternative?
Yeah, so I feel like 4chan type things are like the great example of the difference between anonymous and pseudonymous, right? Like 4chan is like much more on the anonymous side of the spectrum. And I think the difference is that like you can focus on decentralization in the sense of like avoiding other people's negative incentives. And that's definitely kind of part of what's going on. But the other important thing is kind of actively creating positive incentives, right? And if you don't have any notion of persistent identity, then you can't have positive incentives because like there's no persistent thing for those incentives to hook onto. And there's a lot of ways in which you can have persistent identity, persistent reputation, even in ways that are very strongly privacy preserving. I mean, you can have pseudonyms, but then you could even do crazy things like, for example, you switch to a new pseudonym every 2 weeks, but you would have some zero knowledge proof that links your pseudonym to some older pseudonym, and you don't really know which one, but like some kind of reputation score carries over. And you could even have negative reputation scores carry over potentially. Someone underneath the research came up with a way of doing that in a privacy preserving way. So there's there's a lot of kind of room in terms of designing incentives to encourage actively good behavior. And like incentives can mean a lot of things. It can mean like micropayments and monetary rewards. It could mean just like reputation and like just having more people see your content. And it could mean a lot of things, but there's a lot of things that you can do there that I think are fully compatible with the idea that people should be able to kind of post under identities that are separate from the identities that they use for like personal life and work and so forth.
That's great. And the last thing I want to cover before we move on to the audience questions is, I mean, a lot of hackers are building decentralized social networks as part of HackFS. There's over 50 projects that are building a decentralized social network as part of their submission. And what I wanted to do was kind of have each of you just list any popular services or frameworks or just in general, like solutions for each of these things that people need to solve for and have an alternative to as like a list of ingredients that they can use right now to build their project. So I'll name some high-level categories, and if any one of you, without any kind of me picking on somebody, just kind of name the best solutions that kind of help with that, that'll be great, and we can move on to the audience side. So first off, I'll start off with identity verification. What are currently really good alternatives that are decentralized and also help with identity verification and preservation?
So, and I think like when people talk about the identity problem, they talk about it as this one big lump, but really there's a few separate problems that are lumped together, right? So one of them is just the kind of persistent access to an account problem, which is like have some identifier. It could be a long random number or whatever, where if you set up that identifier, you have the ability to maintain that identifier for a long period of time and like write posts using it and so forth. And the main, like, you can obviously do that with a private key. And like, for example, if you have MetaMask or like any Ethereum kind of wallet in your browser, then you can just use an Ethereum address as an identity. And that basically is like, it is a cryptographic key ultimately. But then the challenge with that is that, people can easily forget their keys, lose their keys, and like you need some kind of backup. And like a lot of especially earlier decentralization people kind of don't take this problem seriously, right? And they say, oh, no, we should just require everyone, including like the grandma that's only started using computers 5 or 7 years ago, to like be able to understand like what a paper, how to use paper wallets and all the security things around them. But like I think we do need to kind of take seriously this problem, and the problem of making like basically coming up with ways for people to recover their account if their account gets lost. And this is something that even Twitter does badly, right? Like even Google, like all of these Silicon Valley tech companies somehow do badly, right? Like if you lose your account, you have to appeal to customer service, and sometimes they just never respond to you, and sometimes like more privileged people can have a kind of private channels where they can get listened to more, and a lot of other people just don't have access to those kinds of channels at all. And it's just a problem where people think that you can just talk to the kindly human and they'll figure it out, but often it just isn't true. And the thing that I'm always bullish on is social recovery, right? So this is your idea where you have like some group of friends, like it could be somewhere between 5 and 10 contacts, and say any 2/3 of them can reset your account, right? And kind of the core of this idea is basically that there exist kind of real world links of trust between people, like like no one kind of literally is a kind of a mountain man that literally trusts no one except for themselves and the past versions of themselves that created some private key. But we do have people we can trust, and like in reality, like if 7 of your 10 friends betray you, then that just means you're really, really bad at choosing friends. And the number of people with that problem, I think, is like smaller than the number of people that can't trust centralized services. And so like if we can just make even just social recovery easy to use, smart contract wallets, pick your recovery contacts. You can even make it privacy preserving. For Ethereum, there's an EIP for that. I think it might be 2529 or something. I forget the exact number. Then you have an Ethereum smart contract account that represents your persistent identity, but it's kind of more robust to failures on the human side than a cryptographic key. So anyway, that's like a long digression, but I'm a huge fan of social recovery. So I think it needs to be relentlessly pumped until like lots of people are using it. So the other half of the identity problem is, well, there's two other halves, right? One half is like proving real world properties about yourself that are attested to by authorities. Right, so like proving you're a citizen of some country, proving that you graduated from some university, and all of those things. And ultimately, you can't decentralize those because they just fundamentally depend on a centralized authority. But what you can do is create a kind of common standard and common platform for these attestations to happen. And then the third identity problem is this unique human problem, right? Like basically proving that your account represents a unique human, and an account with this kind of tag is an account such that like one human can only realistically create one or maybe a couple of them, and you can't just like create an unlimited amount of them. And even if you have a lot of money to burn. And like I've written a lot about why this problem is really important for governance, for example, why plutocracy is bad, as I've said on my blog many times. And there's an interesting combination of kind of centralized and decentralized approaches. There's all of the traditional kind of centralized phone number, ID, KYC, whatever verifications. And then there's things like Bright ID that are basically trying to do like social network verification and kind of random interpersonal verification and all of these things. So like we're definitely seeing a lot more experimentation in some of those areas, and like even Gitcoin grants quadratic funding is kind of really doing a lot of just kind of pushing experimentation in that. So looking forward to kind of seeing what works and what sticks. But,
comprehensive list.
I'll suggest some like rapid fire technologies to go with that. I think Vitalik did a great job covering a lot of the space of identity problems, and yeah, this is like a huge nest of interrelated issues that are difficult to solve. I think people should check out Uport. That project did a ton of work in detangling a lot of the issues around identity. You should check out ION, which is an implementation using DIDs, which are decentralized identifiers. DID is quickly becoming the way to think about verifiable claims about identity. There's a lot of different pieces of tools and so on that use them. You should check out, of course, you should use ENS and unstoppable domains and Handshake and BlockSec and all these other kind of domain name mapping to like keys to names to content things. Those can be extremely useful. Things like Civic, things like just all the wallet providers, MetaMask, and so on. You can use those to store keys and to have pieces of identity. I think we need a return to the idea of persona, which was like this Mozilla effort to create identity directly baked into the browser. I think if the operating systems that we had coupled identities for data closer to kind of the identities for logging into the device, I think that would be a good win. The browser might be the right place to put it, or the OS might be the right place to put it. This, I haven't seen that much in terms of experimentation. Keybase is probably the closest thing. So people should check out that and how that works. Unfortunately, Keybase is now going into Zoom. So maybe they'll keep running, but potentially it could be thinking about a decentralized Keybase type of thing. And then thinking of baking that into the browser and the OS, that could be a really useful thing. And so then on top of that, I would say 3box in terms of coupling identity to content, and there's a few other tools. But yeah, there's a ton of these different pieces. Spend some time exploring the space, figure out what you need, and then just use what you need for now. Most things are going to end up with DIDs. It looks like that the DID is like a pretty good convergence point. And then just think of a way to hook it into the browser, either through a wallet or something like it.
No, it's a great list. And maybe for Balaji, I know you recently published a post on how to set up your own Substack through Ghost. And I guess the question I have for you is, through that process, did you think about what the trade-offs were for different other alternatives outside of Ghost? And also, if you were to make a list of what was missing and what you would need probably solutions for, like what are some of those like features?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing I wanted to do was have people set something up that gave them immediate benefit. And a lot of crypto things are cool technologically, but they aren't like immediately world class, the obviously best thing to do. It's like you're doing decentralization for the sake of it, right? I think we're starting to come out of that now, where crypto is actually being used for some really interesting projects, Handshake and the prediction market and stuff and so on. What I would like to see is somebody, maybe a viewer who's looking at this, modify Ghost to accept Ethereum subscriptions. In particular, V1 would just be to do that. And V2 would be to make it possible to do dynamic newspapers, where you could do bundles of individual Ghost websites. And you have like a paid RSS feed, for example, where you let's say pay some Ethereum to it, you get a custom URL, which is a custom RSS link that maybe just works for you. Or it could be global also, whatever, and you just don't share it without, like honor code or something like that. Just like, you could forward the emails you get from Substack, you could repost them. But people don't usually do that, right? It's just kind of honor code. So you do something like that, and then you've got something very powerful, which is you have crypto being used for something novel, where it's not Stripe. That's your only payments mechanism for these kind of paid newsletters. Nothing against Stripe, but it lacks the flexibility.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of with that, just kind of also keeping time in mind, I want to move on to the audience questions here. We have a lot of list of questions that people submitted, so I'll pick a handful of them, and I also want to be respectful of the time of our panelists. But kind of jumping in with like a really interesting question we got. The question is, the last wave of centralized social media just gave us a lot of new verbs on how we communicate, whether it's retweets, tagging your friends, likes, and faves. As like a speculation, what do you think will be the new verbs for the decentralized social media landscape?
Depends on the name of the product.
Fair enough. Do you think there are any fundamentally new concepts that come in when you have a system that is more distributed, so to speak?
I think signal boosting is like a good term that I think we'll start appearing more in either through tokens or through the behavior stuff that Balaji is talking about. Giving weight to something and boosting it, I think will be a term that will stick around.
That's great.
Yeah, I think also like hosting, like everything associated with operating a hub, from hosting to forking a community to banning, all the moderation kind of verbs, I think, come to the fore. These are things that already exist on Reddit and what have you, but I think those become, more important. You start to see just more folks doing that kind of thing.
Balaji, I know you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, just going to say some verb for like let's check what Augur or Omen say about this question.
By the way, one thing I want to just point out, this is maybe very obvious, but I think it's actually pretty interesting for us. Done right, you could turn, so one of the advantages of Substack is there's 100,000 people on there who have credit cards. And so a new publication has a built-in network effect or what have you, right? Done right, if you had an Ethereum ID with crypto in there, you start to get a network effect among things where all Ethereum users or all Bitcoin users can go and sign up for a site. And you have a similar kind of network effect where you would prefer it to be log in with Ethereum or log in with Bitcoin, and then you can pay and you've got identity and so on and so forth. In some ways, that's an obvious use case, but I think it rotates it a little bit where, you just need a community of those folks who will all go and just click to sign up at a site, and you start to get a network effect, and then you start getting more products built around that core. And the critical thing there, of course, is that the account and the money are both, quote, decentralized. So they're not associated with Amazon.com or Substack or what have you, but with a decentralized community. And then you can also have something where you have an Ethereum wallet, for example, or a Bitcoin wallet, where you are pushing effectively notifications and you get paid. So you have your, let's say now you get to a future where there's enough apps that they want to go and attract Ethereum holders, right? Then they pay a task to that wallet, which is a known purchaser of subscriptions. And now, boom, a little offer or task appears and you can click to go and purchase it, right? So that's, a sketch of something where you can start building, a two-sided marketplace around holders and account holders on one hand and services on the other.
No, it's really cool. I think one of the other sort of benefits of a system like this is that you actually also know who the audience is that already subscribes to a set of ideas that you already have. And you can even use their existing subscriptions as a acquisition mechanism to offer them anywhere from discounts to repackaged content or just given access because you already know their identity. And if you know that they can check for these other two subscriptions, they may have access to more content from you because that becomes your actual way to understand or really cater something to them. And there's a couple companies working on this thing as well. So it's a really interesting concept. Balaji, you touched on this thing in one of your earlier answers, but how do you think like decentralized social media platforms can handle hate speech and managing fake news? Like what is kind of a more practical way of doing fact checking?
Well, so let me take the second one first. So in terms of fake news, that can come from centralized sources as well as, random blogs. Like there was a lot of incorrect news reports that were published by, the Washington Post, New York Times, BuzzFeed, Recode, Wired, et cetera, during Corona that mostly have not been retracted, right? To their discredit, because if they were honest, like about searching the truth, they would have done that of their own accord. So it's actually a much more complicated problem. It means that you can't trust any single authority necessarily, other than like a blockchain or something along those lines that has a proof of work or a similar mechanism, which makes it computationally difficult to falsify something. With that said, I think that tools like GPT-3 show how far NLP is advanced, and I think we could start applying something like that for epistemology, where you put in a fact or an assertion rather, and what you get back are essentially knowledge bases that state whether or not that fact is true according to that knowledge base. So for example, you parse all of Wikipedia and you put in an assertion like, I don't know, Ronald Reagan's birthday was so-and-so date, and you get back a true false, right? According to a knowledge base. And that could be wrong. Someone could have typed in.
You got evidence. True false is like very difficult.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So it is, however you want to call it, you can say this knowledge base says that's true, right? That's useful because it could differ. On the topic of hate speech, I think that's extremely difficult because, trying to give the most neutral possible answer I can on that. Let's say, Israel and the Palestinians might differ on what is hate speech, right? And, that's something where it's probably going to be community moderation ultimately that's going to determine that. And what gets really tricky is that some community will not want the other community to exist, or vice versa, right? And so then you basically have information war, between those communities. At least, however, the internal logic of a community is going to be something that I think will be prime. Namely, is it a functional enough community to maintain an internal moderation policy? And if so, then everybody there has opted in. So there's kind of a consent aspect to it. Basically, like the old Reddit used to be, and I think a new Reddit will arise where rather than being locked into a Reddit account and having a bunch of subreddits banned or what have you. And by the way, I respect Steve and the folks at Reddit. I understand why they're doing what they're doing, but rather than something like that, you have this portable Ethereum account where you can go and log into a Ethereum Reddit equivalent, and the moderation is something which is obvious to you when you enter, and if you don't like it, you can exit.
No, that makes sense.
Can I respond to that? I know the timing is short, but I think this topic is super valuable and really useful. I totally agree with what Balaji's talking about. I think that you can. There are a number of projects already aiming to do this. You should look at things like the underlay. The underlay is an effort to. So there's a thing called MetaWeb in the past that ended up becoming the Google Knowledge Graph, and that had built the MetaWeb team built Freebase. And so Freebase was this kind of database-oriented kind of thing, and it tried to do like the true-false version of facts, and so that you could connect it to applications. One really important thing is to kind of build the Bayesian network of inference behind a claim, so that you can get that binary true-false, but you know precisely what facts you've collected along the way. So that when you falsify something, you backprop the change in belief through the network to understand whether something needs to be reverted or not. As what Balaji was saying, like we need to understand that our perception about things changes, or our understanding of things changes. And when those changes happen, things need to be retracted or need to be adjusted, and we need to actually move to a higher knowledge content place. And I think things like so that group created a new project called the Underlay that is trying to solve precisely that. It's trying to create a network of evidence linked together with a belief net, so you understand what the facts might be and so on. And so using those tools could be done right now to plug them in to various different kinds of claims made in social media. Right? And I think like there's the pieces are there, just they need to be put together.
A question for Vitalik. Given that with incentive design and just in general, kind of how these potential decentralized systems may operate, how could you kind of prevent some large corporation from spending enough money to compromise any truth signaling around a fact that they might want to verify or in general? kind of sway the decision of like what people think is actually true or not, or just kind of push their agenda?
I'd say stopping this is a hard problem, and it's definitely not a problem that the existing centralized platforms have succeeded at. And can we improve kind of improve much on the status quo? Like there's things that we can do, like we can create better reputation systems, try to kind of better distinguish between real kind of accounts representing real people and civil accounts, like at least when like even just catch those cases where, like on Twitter, for example, when you know who makes a poll and then suddenly 5,000 likes appear, and so if like there's things that we can kind of do on the margin in terms of just reducing the ability to kind of fake the level of support or the level of popularity or something. And it definitely does kind of will have to involve a kind of moving away from essentially treating every account as though it's the same. But then kind of moving beyond that, like there's real challenges, and it's harder, and a lot of it will just involve a kind of some kind of active defense. So if someone pushes some position, then it's kind of on the responsibility of someone else to kind of actively figure out kind of points to what exactly is wrong with it, and for that to get signal boosted and so forth. So I don't think there's one silver bullet. I think there's kind of a bunch of things that can help. We'll see.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And something both Juan and Balaji touched on earlier in their answers, but there's a lot of questions that we're getting on kind of what are actually really good business models for these decentralized networks. I mean, tokens are one. You kind of said that ads are not going to die, likely. But do you think that fundamentally the way the onus on the payments and the cost of like subsidizing the system being in a way positioned towards the users who are consuming the platform kind of will prevent people to connect positively and interact? Like, do you think that actually becomes a problem in the network itself growing? Or are there alternatives to sustaining a network like that?
I mean, I think what the current social media world got extremely good at was reducing the friction coefficients around sharing material and sharing content and signing up for the platforms. Those were the main gating factors. And so they built their entire kind of growth teams and so on oriented around getting more content and causing more content to appear and more people to sign up and all that kind of stuff. And I think what's gonna shift now is that we now care a lot more about other friction coefficients. We now care about making it high friction to cause the battles that Balaji is pointing out, that those kinds of like, kind of harassment and attacks and so on become more thoughtful and more as opposed to just kind of like these devolved arguments that just are basically useless and just dissipate time. And so I think modeling the system and the friction coefficients everywhere might help somebody build a much better system that tunes the incentives the right way, and that includes the when you think about a business model that will power this thing, whatever it might be, think of the friction coefficients associated with that business model and what parties might be trying to benefit from that business model. So, for example, right now, the spread of information and the utility to something like Facebook of having a very incendiary article is so high because it brings so many people to the platform that they let slide all kinds of stuff that another platform might totally put the brakes on, and that's because that's where the business model is. And so, modeling the behaviors that you want to see and what you want to have happen, and the friction coefficients around those, and then modeling the behaviors that the business model might engender, and the friction coefficients around that might help you understand what you should really be building, and making sure that what the thing you're building actually fits that model is a whole other problem.
Yeah, I agree with Juan a lot actually here, in the sense of, when there are like a fight on a social media platform is a pain in the ass and is a negative sum in arguably for the world. But it is, even though it's negative for the world, of the various actors that are getting something out of it, Twitter is getting something out of it because it's selling ads, right? Millions of views, and like it's basically like a boxing match or whatever, right? Both parties have some cuts, but the promoter sold some seats, right? And I think that term in the equation, if you actually go and write out the game theory of the payoff matrix, you have something where yeah, I mean, it's almost like stealing money in the sense of, you're making these two parties poorer, but Twitter itself is gaining. I'm not saying it's like intentionally like that, but when you are just optimizing for engagement over all else, and you've got page views without any kind of moral dimension to it, that there's an issue there, right? And so I think that where it gets interesting is you start including those missing terms in the equation and asking, can we quantify what is happening offline? Can we quantify what is happening in the world, and potentially add some future time orientation to it, right? So I'll give one example that I've been thinking a great deal about, which is, can we have folks declare their values, right? So, let's say you're funding a new media site. How do you know that it doesn't, just descend into cake memes and clickbait, right? Because that's what the news cycle is, right? And everybody who sets up a media site, you have some highfalutin idea of what it's going to be. But if you're actually chasing profit and you have to pay the bills, you need page views, and so you kind of get pulled into this lowest common denominator thing. So, and that's the same as a social media site, right? So what do? Well, one possibility is you define this is one sketch of an idea. Feel free to critique it or whatever, but you define a values.txt file which has the keywords that you are trying to drive positive sentiment for over 5 years. For example, let's say you're trying to solve, climate change with technology. So the keywords you'd be trying to boost would be like fusion energy, smart grid, solar panels, electric cars, carbon scrubbing, whatever, stuff like that, right? And crucially, what you could then do is you could take in your values.txt with these 10 or 15 keywords or 100, whatever, and then you score it against every piece of content on the site. You take your RSS feed and you pull every post, every tweet, every video, et cetera, and you pull the captions and you score it, and you get a table of keywords by posts. And each entry is either gray because you didn't mention that keyword, or it's green because you said it with positive sentiment, or it's red where it was negative sentiment. And the idea is that you also track in the population at large sentiment over time, and you see if it's rising from 1% to 5% to 20% of the population. What's the point here? The point here is that you would now have values constrained page views, where if you cranked out listicles and Q&A and so on, it would be on fusion energy, right? So your content would be constrained to basically fit within these self-declared values. And it wouldn't just be sort of the amoral search of clicks, but it'd be a cause that you had self-defined in advance that you're going to stick to for a period of time, right? And the thesis is that actually creates more value for society over time, because it's not just the head snapping, memoryless, look over here, look over there aspect of Twitter. You're actually declaring a long-term objective that you're going to work towards over years, or even longer than that, right? And I think something along those lines of restoring long-term value orientation and value creation, so values.txt kind of has a dual meaning here, right? Will hopefully create more wealth in the long run. So, like a burning building or a fight gains engagement, but it also destroys value. Creating value should create more short-term value as well, if you can figure out how to make the maturity functions match up. So that's something I've thought a lot about.
That's a really interesting concept. I'd love to learn more about that after. Just to kind of ask the last question here, and we can kind of conclude this panel. For each of you, what's going to be your first post on the new decentralized social media platform of your choice, or of your dreams, with all the features that you want, and what would the first thing you're going to publish there? And we'll start that with Vitalik. What would you like to talk about when that happens?
What would I like to talk about on the decentralized social media of our dream?
What would be your first post on that new decentralized platform of your dreams?
I see a comment saying, "Oh, flame softball question." See, the problem is that like the vague questions are always the hardest. Like, you know, you get into this mode where like you're always afraid of not coming up with an answer that's clever enough, and then it just becomes so extremely terrible. Okay.
Rick Astley.
No, you broke the Vitalik. I don't know. I mean, realistically, it'll just be like a blog post about math or whatever.
So I'm gonna use the question to give some advice for folks, and so I'll claim that, probably not gonna do this, but I'll claim that the post that I would write would be a post about giving advice to people trying to build this stuff. So I would say that it would be a post talking about how media, both kind of like the traditional media structures and social media, which are kind of like intertwined, we really need to think of them as universal public utilities. So not international, not national utilities, not international utilities, not even transnational. Really think bigger. Think of something that's kind of humanity oriented, and think of the incentive structures behind that, and think of building mechanisms and systems that don't put too much stock in any one nation's perspective, but enables those nations and those local jurisdictions to build their own subnets with their own rules. And then people should be able to opt in or opt out of those and exit and move between those. And so I think systems right now are way too overfitting of specific nations that happen to have a lot of power. And that's creating really bad structures that other nations are exploiting. And so the nationalism problem that we're seeing play out in media and disinformation campaigns, and like, you know, side note, go and watch like the amazing interviews with ex-KGB spies about the disinformation campaigns. They're amazing, and you can see what's going on right now and relate it to that. That's just straight up. But really think about systems that are resistant to that kind of stuff, and think of the role of journalism and of journalists and the people and the publishers and so on as vectors for good information that needs to be moved around, where good is kind of defined by those subnets or defined globally. And in kind of the global version, it's kind of an objective truth perspective, versus in those subnets, it's kind of an intersubjective truth to those groups. And think of the role of those folks in those networks, and how to promote really good high quality things to appear. Because it's not about, like, we've shown that quantity can happen, and we've shown the problems that happen because of quantity. And so really focus on quality. And then also remember that privacy of information is a really critical thing. And we've sort of lost that right now. And these systems are accumulating a huge amount of information that will probably come back and haunt a lot of people, meaning the 21st century is long. We're at the beginning of it. And the 20th century also looked really nice at the beginning, but turned really bad. And it could be that the 21st century turns really bad as well. And there's a lot of information online that is easily accessible by a lot of people that could cause a lot of problems. And so pay attention to that and be careful with that, and move the world into much more pseudonymous kind of behavior, where digital identity is actually decoupled from physical human identity as much as we can. We kind of, the pendulum swung too far into making pseudonymous identity disappear. And then I would probably give a you know, just a call for just doing this with, there's a ton of people that went into journalism because they really care about the truth, and they really care about protecting the disadvantaged communities, and protecting and getting much better quality outcomes for their groups, for their nation, and so on. And you know, the entire history of journalism is filled with incredible important advances and improvements that came simply because there was a series of articles that caused some important change to happen. And so just recall that that's the point, and that even though right now the entire media incentive structure is kind of messed up, both in traditional media and in social media, and let's figure out how we can return to build a system that promotes that, and acknowledges that now anybody can be one of these publishers and journalists, as long as you build a good audience and you are good at what you do. And so that's building a system that can promote high quality outcomes through that, I think will be one of the better uses of time that you could have for the next 5 years. So if you really care about this, like stick with it and help build like a much better public utility.
And maybe just to conclude with Balaji, any advice or your first post on a new decentralized platform, what would that be?
My first post on a decentralized platform, I'm sorry, can you, like, what would I post? What would be my first post on like the decentralized Facebook?
Yes, of your dreams.
Yeah, I hacked the question to like pontificate for a while, so feel free to do the same.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I didn't have the context. What would my first post be? Probably a task of some kind to get people to start doing productive work, you know, so that like they would actually create something. I think, you know, just to riff on this for a second, you know, Wikipedia is an example of collaborative work on the internet. And, you know, in a Google Doc, you can have multiple people editing at the same time. And, you know, there's operational transformation has been an algorithm for a while in terms of something that you can do to take a bunch of different contributions and link them together. But there's now new things called conflict-free replicated data types, which actually make it, you know, a little bit easier from a programming standpoint to build something like a Google Docs. My point is that I think taking that stuff and merging it with crypto and with social networks, you might have something where the fundamental unit of action is not just, oh, let me tweet something or let me put up an Instagram post or something like that, but oh, let me give a unit of work that's a remunerated unit of work that can be merged into a larger whole. For example, writing a book in a decentralized way, documenting a code base, annotating something, et cetera, right? So that would be something I'd like to see, you know, first post in a decentralized social network that doesn't just give us these benefits of, you know, like self-sovereignty, but actually starts using the internet as a way for us to build useful things online together.
Awesome. I was really hoping you would say keywords from GPT-3. They'll just make the post itself and you just post it, but I'll take that answer too. But with that, I want to thank all three of you so much for being with us and going a little bit over time to answer everybody's questions and being part of this panel. So Vitalik, Balaji, Juan, thanks so much and really appreciate all your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. This is a really good, fun conversation.